Jonathan, we saw the shooting in Australia just now. Pretty horrific images. And I want to start off by getting your initial reaction when you saw the news.
My initial reaction was, sadly, that I wasn't surprised. This is what it means when people say globalize the Intifada. I was in Australia a few months ago, beginning of the year, was on Bondi Beach itself. And I remember speaking with members of the Jewish community. And the biggest sense and sentiment that I got from them was that they were feeling betrayed by their legislators and exposed by law enforcement, because the atmosphere in Australia is an atmosphere that really enabled anti-Semitic attacks, that made it okay and normalized behavior, that where radicals feel free to shout anti-Semitic slogans, to call gas the Jews, and to attack synagogues and Jewish worshippers, or just ordinary Jewish Australians on the streets. All this was normalized by what I see as a weak and cowardly Australian government, who was very quick to side with Hamas, very quick to side with Palestinians, very quick to demonize Israel and criticize Israel and hold Israel to impossible standards that Australia doesn't meet in combat. And I think this is the atmosphere. And when these 2 or 3 attackers, one of them Muslim, but we don't yet know their organizational affiliation, that's being looked at as we're speaking, when they decided to attack 2,000 Australian civilians celebrating Hanukkah, I wasn't surprised, and it's just a matter of timing and when it would happen. Extremely sad to see this happen. Australia is a beautiful country. Bondi Beach is a great place to be, and Jews in Australia have had a really long and beautiful run of living in paradise. I really hope that won't end. And I hope that Jews in Australia will get the full support and protection that they are entitled to as loyal Australian civilians. And I really hope that there will be change in Australia, and that this atmosphere of anti-Semitism, which has been prevailing and very conducive, that it will change, and that the leadership in Australia will really think differently about what they do, what they say, and who they side with in global affairs.
The statement that Mr. Conricus just made there is very much redolent of a statement that was put out today by Prime Minister Netanyahu, in which he recalls that back in August, he sent a letter to Prime Minister Albanese of Australia, warning him that his foreign policy posture was fomenting anti-Semitism. So here's what Netanyahu said and what he repeated today. Your call for a Palestinian state pours fuel on the anti-Semitic fire. It rewards Hamas terrorists. It emboldens those who menace Australian Jews, and so forth. So Netanyahu is trying to attribute this attack to the position that was taken by the Australian government endorsing the establishment of a Palestinian state. But what I wanted to ask Mr. Conricus is, what is the limiting principle there? Because you have a very diverse range of people who in some fashion have called for the establishment of a Palestinian state, however that might be defined. The former Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, is currently on a tour, including in the United States, with a Palestinian counterpart, promoting a proposal of his for the establishment of a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders. You had the UN Security Council in November pass unanimously a blueprint that ratified the Trump plan for Gaza that included, albeit somewhat vaguely, but still, an affirmation that there must be, quote, a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. So if we're going to accuse any political figure who might have endorsed the establishment of a Palestinian state as being culpable for one of these random attacks of violence, couldn't that potentially implicate a huge range of people, maybe even Donald Trump himself, for being culpable of such wrongdoing? Like, what's the limiting principle there? How is that a sustainable line of critique?
Jonathan?
Yeah, I think we have to look at it a bit deeper and a bit more, seriously. because what's been going on in Australia is far beyond just recognizing a Palestinian state in the aftermath of the bloodiest terror attack that Israel has ever faced, where 1,200 Israelis were murdered by Hamas on the 7th of October, some of them in the most atrocious way. And what disturbs many Israelis, and I'm not here as a spokesperson for Netanyahu, but what disturbs many Israelis, right, left, and center, is that linkage between atrocities conducted by jihadi terrorists in the most gruesome fashion, including murdering women, children, elderly, taking them hostage, bringing them into Gaza, starting a war, and then countries like Australia saying, well, this looks like a reasonable thing for us to support and to give a trophy to, and to basically condone and say, well, we'll draw a straight line, a logical line between October 7 and Palestinian statehood. And I think another important point here is that it doesn't come in a vacuum. Australia, I think in Sydney, we saw the first October 8th so-called spontaneous protests, marches, demonstrations. I recall videos of thousands of whatever you can call them, pro-Hamas, Islamists, pro-Palestinians, whatever, chanting "Gas the Jews" in Sydney, just a few miles away from Bondi Beach, in the famous harbor close to the Opera House. Gas the Jews, because on October 7, the Jews did some very obviously something very horrible, and that was allowed Hamas to come in and massacre 1,200 Israelis. And the spontaneous response out on the street in Australia was of thousands, if not tens of thousands, of pro-Hamas people who felt the urge to go out and show their support for Palestinians. And this was long before.
But again, what is
Michael? Let me ask two questions to Jonathan. I'll give you the mic. So, on the statement of Gaza Jews in those protests, Jonathan, what do you think the Australian government should have done? I'm a supporter of free speech. I think you are as well. Should people that say Gaza Jews be arrested? Should they not be allowed to protest or say these statements? What's your solution?
I think it's a pretty clear example of incitement and calls for violence against a certain ethnic group. It's a racist and an extremist thing to say, to gas the Jews, and I think that is beyond the line of free speech. But I think where Australian authorities failed systemically when it comes to this situation was that they allowed Hamas supporters and others, Iranian-backed Islamists and many other people, basically take control over the public domain in the main cities of Australia. I personally saw and actually confronted a few Hamas supporters in Melbourne on a Saturday as they were walking through central Melbourne towards the parliament, and they were doing so with the approval of the local government and with the support of the police, chanting violent slogans against Jews, harassing businesses. And when Jewish Australians, loyal, patriotic, tax-paying, and law-abiding citizens of that lovely country complained about it, they were told, well, nothing to do and just go somewhere else. And while you're doing it, take off your kippah or any other Jewish symbol so that you won't incite them to do anything. And there's been multiple attacks on synagogues and on Jewish community centers. Jews are forced to have special security organizations, community volunteer organizations in Australia, where they protect buses and schools and synagogues and kindergartens, all of that because the local authorities have been very, very feeble and weak in doing their job. And many Australians have said, we feel exposed. We feel that it's okay for the other side to harass and to extend their liberties of free speech and to go very much beyond and to be aggressive, to attack synagogues. For instance, no people have been brought to justice. None of the hate crimes have been solved in Australia. I just looked before coming on. I haven't seen anybody brought to justice for instance, graffiti on synagogues or throwing even excrement and many other things at synagogues, or threats that have been made. So it's the issue here is not free speech, but it's an atmosphere of violence and anti-Semitism that enables.
Michael, I've got two more questions for you, Jonathan. Michael, I'll give you the mic to respond to all the points. You talked about the protests, and you've called some of them, most of them, Hamas sympathizers, and you've sometimes used the word of Palestinian supporters, pro-Palestinian protesters. Where do you draw the line between a pro-Palestinian protest? Or first, do you think there is a line between a pro-Palestinian protester and a pro-Hamas protester?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions in the West in general is the fake distinction between pro-Hamas and pro-Palestinian. I think if we ask Palestinians, and if we look at Palestinian polls done by Palestinians of Palestinian sentiment, whether it's in Gaza or in what I call Judea and Samaria, what you probably would refer to as the West Bank, PA areas, then the sentiment is that Hamas is the most popular political organization, and if elections were held today, they would win by varying degrees of majority, whether it's in PA controlled areas or in Gaza.
But it's well below, but still well below 100%. And during the elections that they won, it was about 50%. So there's still half of Gaza residents back then that did not support Hamas. So do you think it's fair to not draw a line between the two?
So one could try, and it would be an interesting academic exercise to do. I think it's artificial. And I think that the situation today, where I've seen personally thousands of demonstrators out on streets, whether it's in Australian cities or other places around the West, when they started marching on October 7 and October 8, before Israel had done anything, and they were out in the streets calling for the destruction of Israel, calling for globalize the Intifada, calling to discriminate Israel and to stop Israel from defending itself. It really doesn't matter so much if they say that they're openly Hamas or if they claim that they are just, Palestinian nationalists. For me, that's a superficial definition. And most of these people, there are a lot of people who have been paid, especially in the US and in the UK, to go out on the streets. We saw that on campuses, the encampments on various of the campuses, Columbia and NYU and Stanford. Many places there were paid protesters who were there on a salary, organized, and they said what they were supposed to say, and they were paid accordingly. But I put them aside and I look at people who are more driven by ideology. And yes, I think today, we could actually go beyond and say that it's quite a superficial distinction, and that the dominant Palestinian political organization today, sadly, is Hamas. I wish that wasn't the situation, but sadly, that is the situation. And when people are marching out on the streets, in essence, what they are supporting, celebrating is Hamas. They may hide it, they may not say that front and center, but that is what I have seen and believe is the majority of the situation.
Michael, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, you can claim that this isn't about free speech somehow, but if you are citing chants and slogans which you regard as having produced unacceptable levels of anti-Semitic sentiment that eventually have allegedly now given rise to attacks like we've just seen in Australia, and you are condemning the government, whether it's Australia or any place else, for not having taken stringent enough action to curtail that speech, then that is a free speech issue, because however contemptible we might find the speech, to call on the government to somehow block or stymie or impede the expression of that speech is a free speech issue. Which is why
is inciting violence though free speech? Gas the Jews is inciting violence.
In the United States, it certainly is. Obviously, Australia has a different form of government. Israel has a different form of government. But in the United States, we, as I'm sure Jonathan knows, cherish the First Amendment as foundational to our constitutional order, and gas the Jews as something that I find contemptible, and I think 99.9% of people would. It doesn't rise to the level of incitement that the Supreme Court has identified as speech which the government may curtail, because it's not a particularized injunction for imminent violence. It's more of an abstract slogan. Now, you can condemn it, you can criticize it all you want, and many people surely do. But I think it's also a bit tenuous or a bit unconvincing to cite that one chant, which is a little bit garbled, I have to say. It was from December of 2023, I believe, or maybe it was from October, and say that that is what is causative as to a mass shooting in December of 2025. You know, Jonathan has repeated a misconception that has often been repeated by spokespersons of the Israeli government, which Jonathan formerly was. Now he has an affiliation with a U.S. think tank and so forth, but he was once a spokesperson for the Israeli government.
Military.
And they
for the military, never for the government, for the military.
Okay, well, I was broadly construed the military as a faction of the government, right? It's under the command of Netanyahu, although I know there's always debate in Israel as to what extent the political leadership is in charge of the military. But leaving that aside, you repeated what I think is a very widespread misconception, which is that the protesters after October 7th are demonstrably anti-Semitic or motivated by some foul, sinister motive that wasn't just about defending the humanity of people in Gaza or whatever, because they started protesting before Israel had done anything retaliatory into Gaza after October 7th. However, the IDF, and I just double-checked this, the IDF announced that it was taking retaliatory military action, which I'm sure you recall as an IDF spokesperson, 1 or 2 hours after the Hamas incursion on October 7th. So there was already
both
Israeli
of us know that
retaliation
wasn't
underway.
what they were responding to. Both of us know, let's not be naive.
It wasn't.
That was not what they were responding to. They were out on the streets in jubilant joy all over the world, in many places, many cities around the world, because Hamas stuck it to the Israelis. That is what they were out celebrating. They were out there, and believe me, I've spoken to a lot of them, and I've spoken with Arab and Muslims in the UK, in the US, to a few in Australia. The sentiment was one of pride, of joy, of jubilant exhilaration that, oh, finally, someone had handed it to the Jews and that Hamas had humiliated the Israelis. It wasn't about that Israel was starting to retaliate and to start, firing.
But be that as it may,
So let's not be naive.
Hold on a second. But be that as it may, and I don't deny that there were certain people who were protesting or, celebrating the October 7th attacks. I spoke to some of them myself. I was in Birmingham, England, shortly after October 7th, which is has a large Muslim population. And I personally spoke to people who were protesting, who had very extreme views toward Israel and were supportive of the October 7th incursion. So I'm not denying that sentiment exists. However, that doesn't justify you misstating the factual chronology, which is that the Israeli military itself, the IDF, announced that it was taking retaliatory military action into Gaza 1 or 2 hours after the Hamas incursion. So we can accept that there were certain people who were jubilant, perhaps, about the fact of the Hamas incursion, but we don't need to misstate the facts as to the chronology of the Israeli military campaign, right?
Jonathan, I'll let you respond.
The chronology of the event is that Hamas attacked and did an unprecedented, unprovoked attack into Israel, killing 1,200. By the way, we only got to the final number of murdered. I think it was 4 or 5 days later, or perhaps even more than that, because it took us time to identify body parts, charred pieces of human flesh. We had to do DNA and bone testing. And it took us, actually, I think it almost took us a week to get our heads around the amount of people that had been murdered. And we actually took us a lot of time to understand who was missing, who was abducted, who was murdered, and who was alive and well, and who was in hospital. So no, that is not the case. And Israel didn't launch anything significant of a military maneuver on October the 7th. I was on the ground myself. What we did was frantically we scrambled in order to close the border and kill the remaining Palestinians and Hamas terrorists who were inside Israeli territory. That, by the way, took us 3 days until we could finally get that done. And only then did we start, wrapping our heads around what on earth had happened. And then we started planning the obvious counterattack and the big offensive against Gaza. So if we want to look at the details, those are the details.
I want to go back quickly to the attack in Australia. So first, a question I have for you, Jonathan. I know your stance on, obviously, Hamas and Palestinians as well. What's your stance on Islam as a religion? So that's coming under a lot of scrutiny right now with the attacks that we've seen in the US, in Europe, and in Australia.
Islam as a religion? monotheistic faith, and almost 2 billion people adhere to it. I think with the fastest growing numbers in the West, a religion that definitely seeks to expand and gain new followers and grow in numbers. I have no specific issue with Islam as an organization. I have an issue, and I feel threatened by, both as an Israeli and as a Westerner, by Islamist ideology and by an imperialistic mindset. The same imperialistic mindset that led the Arab conquest of the Middle East, of the land of Israel, of Persia, of Mesopotamia, of North Africa, Spain, attempts in France and Turkey. That mindset is still around. And my issue is that that is an imperialistic mindset that seeks to conquer and subjugate. My biggest problem is that I think a lot of people around the world in the West, specifically in the West, still don't get it, still don't understand what kind of people they have let in their societies, what these people really want, and what they're out to achieve, and what they believe in. And they do a cardinal sin, many Europeans, of not listening, not understanding the culture or the language of those people, and not listening to what they say or what they write. And there are a lot of examples around the world of imperialistic, expansionist thinking, which is perpetrated by political institutions of Islamists all over the West. And if you actually listen to them, they'll say it pretty clearly that our objective isn't to live as a minority in Birmingham or London or Manchester or Paris or Toronto, Montreal or New York or Melbourne. Our objective is actually to dominate, to take control, and eventually to change the type of governance that exists there. And it isn't rule of law, civil rights, freedom of speech, and all of that Western nonsense. It is Sharia, a very strict interpretation of it. And that is what many Islamists, not every Muslim in the West, but Islamists are trying to promote. And that, I think, is really the defining frontier and the defining cultural battle that is ongoing now in the West. Some people have understood that things have gone astray and that drastic measures are needed. I'll give an example of Sweden. I grew up in Sweden, in Malmö. I was born in Jerusalem, but I grew up in Sweden, in Malmö. And up until just a few years ago, Sweden had an open borders policy. Every refugee, half refugee, anybody who wanted to migrate to Sweden was welcomed. So from all of the countries, war-torn countries in Africa and in the Middle East, people came to Sweden and they were given very generous accommodation packages and subsidies and support. And things have really gone astray in Sweden. And today, and I'll finish, today, Sweden has a zero immigration policy. They went from being extreme and basically allowing everybody in to now understanding that they went way too far and they allowed into their society people who do not compute with their cultural standards, with the rule of law, with democracy, with civil rights, with liberty, with enlightenment or civil rights for women and minorities, and that they're really scrambling to defend their community. And the first thing that they did was to close borders. And I think that's an example of where things are going.
I don't disagree with you there, but what do you make of the hero that tackled one of the shooters and took the gun, got shot in the shoulder and the hand, who's also a Muslim, potentially an immigrant as well? His name is Ahmed Al-Ahmed, owns a fruit shop in Sydney, and he saved a lot of Jews that were getting shot at by that other Muslim who is an extremist criminal.
I salute him. I think I saw the video and I've seen the reports. I know that he's wounded. I wish him a full and swift recovery. I think he should be awarded the highest merit of bravery in Australia, because what he did was exactly what's expected of a citizen, to understand a horrible situation unfolding. He risked his own life, was brave, and assaulted one of the attackers, and was pretty effective in doing so. It would have been great if he would have used a rifle to shoot that attacker, but he was nevertheless very brave, and I salute him. And what I said about Islam, I think it goes exactly along those lines. My issue isn't with Muslim people. I have Muslim friends and I respect their religion. I study their religion. I've read the Quran. I speak Arabic. Why? Because I live in the Middle East and I want to know who I'm surrounded with, and I understand that these are my future potential friends. My issue is with people who believe that I don't have a right to live here, and people who want to change the West and who have a dominant or an imperialistic mindset. And Ahmed Ben Ahmed is a great example of someone who is obviously different.
Michael,
Mary,
I'll
if
go
I
back to
could
you,
just
Michael.
comment on that.
I will go back to you just because we don't have too much time, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this. But Michael, I'll get your thoughts and Jonathan's thoughts on a claim that I saw to be pretty ridiculous. Two claims. One of them is that Israel's behind this attack. It's a false flag attack by Israel, which for me doesn't even warrant a discussion. But also a lot of claims, including by Israeli journalists, about Israeli officials checking if Iran or Hezbollah are behind today's terror attack. Do you think it's even worth discussing right now? Because there hasn't been any evidence to point towards that. Iran has condemned the attack, and also has been reports by some that one of the shooters is a believer of the Salafi sect of Islam, which obviously sees the Iranians as I'm not sure what the term is, but not true Muslims.
Infidel.
Yeah,
I mean, there's no evidence for either claim that either Mossad or Iran is behind this attack. Of course, people want to rush to make the facts or lack of facts comport with their own preferred political agenda. And the political agenda of Israel, it's no secret, is one of antagonism toward Iran and advocating for military action against Iran, such as they undertook in June of this year with the assistance of the U.S. So any little data point that comes across the transom that they can potentially use to further bolster their case for continued action against Iran, they're going to seize. But I just want to comment on a few things that Jonathan said there. I would be remiss to not note. Yeah,
we'll go. Yeah. I'd love to get your thoughts on it because we don't have too much time in today. It's not an hour interview today, unfortunately. Just on that point, Michael, give me your thoughts on whether Hezbollah, Iran, or obviously Israel is behind this, which I think all the claims are just baseless. But Jonathan, do you think any of these claims could have some sort of truth to them?
Yeah, I'll say it shortly. Yes, they can have. These guys, I saw the videos. These guys didn't look very professional. I think sadly they could have butchered many more Jews there if they had acted, with more efficiency, if they had moved and not just been stationary. Basically, it could have been a tremendous slaughter, but these attackers, from my perspective, didn't look as well as if they were well trained or really knew what they were doing. And we've seen this in the past with the Iranians, where they've failed to actually launch attacks with proper Iranian agents, with the Quds Force, which is their expeditionary wing of the main organization, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps. And so what they do at that times is that they use local, they basically outsource and use criminals or disenfranchised people. It could be, that could be the scenario here. But I agree, there's no evidence about it, but there is a mountain of evidence which has been an information that has been shared by Mossad and Israeli authorities to Australian authorities of intentions of the Iranians to do exactly that. But it's still too early. We still haven't seen real evidence. And these terrorists were sadly able to murder 11 people, but I think they were not very well trained or very effective. And had it been, ISIS-style people with assault rifles, and if they'd been moving more, charging towards where the unarmed Jews were, then they could have, I think, inflicted much more damage.
And Iran was pretty quick in condemning the attacks as well.
Listen, the Iranians lie whenever they speak. They are master deceivers, and they are constantly claim as if they speak about international rights and rule of law and order and civil liberties, yet they are an oppressive regime that subjugates women and minorities and is failing even to provide basic services for their own people, and spends about 30-40% of their national budget to export terror outside of their borders. So I don't believe anything that the Iranians say. It's lip service, and usually it's well done lip service, but not very impressive.
Yeah, but the fallacy here, Mario,
Michael.
is that dwelling on the potential or claimed connection of Iran to this event obscures that events just such as these were utterly foreseeable as a function of blowback from the protracted Israeli campaign of obliteration in Gaza.
Why should that be blowback? What's the connection? What have Australian civilians to do with the fighting in Gaza? They weren't fighting in Gaza. They're not Israelis. What's the blowback here?
Jonathan, that was a question. I'll read out Trump's tweets for that, Jonathan. Not tweets, his comments. The war in Gaza is hurting Israel. There's no question about it. They may be winning the war, but they're losing the support. And he told Bibi, you can fight individual battles, but the world's turning against you. And then he says another statement there. He says they're losing the PR war. So seeing all these images and videos of kids and people killed in Gaza, you don't think that will lead to people filled with anger that will go and kill innocent Jews, thinking they're avenging people that are being killed in Palestine?
I think it's I think it's a totally irrational thing to say and think and believe. And I think it's perverse. What's the connection between Australian Jews and IDF fighting against Hamas?
There might not be a straightforward connection. There almost certainly is no straightforward connection between Chabadniks in Australia celebrating Hanukkah and the Israeli annihilation campaign in Gaza. But a function of blowback is that certain people will act irrationally. Certain people will have delusions of a connection that they can try to posit and then take extreme action on account of that. Back in May of this year in the United States, as I'm sure you remember, there was an attack on a Jewish museum in Washington, D.C., in which two employees of the Israeli consulate were killed on the street. And that could also be understood as a form of blowback.
The shooter was calling, I think the guy was saying free Palestine when he killed them as well.
Yeah, his ideological motives were very clearly stated. And it's not to condone or justify the action, to observe that it could be the product of blowback as a result of these images, as even Trump himself has previously noted, of harrowing devastation and destruction in Gaza. And also, furthermore, in May of this year, the United States was not taking a position in terms of foreign policy that was redolent of what the Australian government took in terms of endorsing the two-state solution or endorsing the establishment of a Palestinian state. And yeah,
on the contrary, very different, Michael. Why
blame Australian policymakers for this mass casualty attack today, for their policy choices having been a contributing cause, but not blame the United States government back in May when the policy orientation was much different? It doesn't really make sense in terms of consistency.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense because the U.S. has acted differently. The U.S. in many cases, in many states, has acted differently and sent a very clear message that we do not condone Hamas supporters on our streets, and many legislators and elected officials, and most importantly, the president and the White House, have been very clear about what they believe in and what they condone. So I wouldn't make that comparison at all. And regarding the previous point that we're trying to make and normalize here, there's a difference between understanding cause and effect and condoning. Of course, there is a relation. There's a relation and an influence of how the war between Hamas and Israel is portrayed in Arab and Western media. The incitement campaign against Israel, the delegitimization campaign against Israel, and how Israel is vilified for defending itself against a terror organization. Of course, there is a relationship between that and what all kinds of extremists and crazy people around the world feel that they should do in order to respond to whatever they're seeing or being spoon-fed on social media or by organizations like Al Jazeera. Sadly, yes, mass
Or
propaganda.
Haaretz. I mean, you say it's all Arab and Western media. Haaretz is the source for much of this.
Yeah.
Okay. So also Israeli media then. Also Israeli media.
Some fringe parts, small fringe parts of Israeli media definitely have been fanning the flames as well. But the point here being that, of course, yes, incitement works. Incitement is very powerful. Social media is very powerful. And when people are subject to relentless incitement, blood libels, fake news, false allegations, and distortions against Israel, then yeah, sure, sometimes people take action. And unfortunately, the ones who pay the price for said acts of violence and terrorism are usually unarmed Jewish civilians around the world.
So we agree there has been
Michael,
sadly foreseeable blowback to the Israeli military campaign in Gaza.
Guys, I really appreciate Jonathan, as always. Thank you so much for your time. Michael, thanks a lot for joining as well. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.